Hello, our presentation is on measures of climate change, specifically the impact of climate change on migration around the world. This is for an Environment 310 class. And our team is me, Zahra Hassan. I'm a senior in HCDE.
And I'm Simone Chadha. I'm also a senior in HCDE.
I am Pimnipa. I'm also a senior in HCDE.
And I'm Annie Chang. I'm a senior in ACD as well.
So our agenda is an overview, and then we go into data search and preparations, following key data tables, and descriptive statistics, as well as going into our three research questions, conclusion, and then future work.
Okay, and then a little bit of an overview about our project. Our group is interested in exploring measurements of climate change, specifically how natural disasters and CO2 emissions might impact in migration patterns. And the significance of this is related to climate change, and as it becomes more severe, it affects weather and natural disasters along the world around the world. And this impacts millions of lives around the world and results in migration across the globe. And then we are hoping that by exploring this information, we can see if there are any patterns of migration related to CO2 emissions and know how climate change might play a role in a country's population and migration. And this analysis would also help us understand whether CO2 emissions and climate change are significant factors in migration, or whether there are other significant factors that are more impactful. And then moving on to our research questions, we had an overarching question of how does climate change impact migration? And we had three more specific research questions to explore this overarching question. The first one being, is there a relationship between total CO2 emissions and the number of people migrating to different regions? And then the second one that we explored was, do regions that experience more climate-related natural disasters also have higher migration rates? And then the third one was, is there a relationship between gender and migration? And does this have a correlation with areas of high CO2 emission? And the first data source that we looked at is from the United Nations, and it's specifically related to international migrant stock. So it kind of has information about migrant origins and destinations, and it includes data for every 5 years. And for our data sources, we decided to focus from the years 2000 to 2024. So in this case, it kind of increased by 5 years. So it would be 2000, 2005, 2010, and so on. And so to clean this data, we mainly made sure that we included the countries that we wanted to focus on, which you'll find out a little bit more about later. But yeah, moving on to our second data source. This one's related to world population data. So this includes the population statistics for every country. And then our third data source is related to annual CO2 emissions per country. So this includes the same data about countries, but just related to their total CO2 emissions in tons. And then our fourth data source was related to natural disasters in each country. And this one has natural disasters organized by different types. And so to clean the second, third, and fourth data sources, we just made sure to include years increasing by every 5 years, starting from the year 2000. And this key summary data table will kind of illustrate that a little clearly. So on the left side, you can see the 6 chosen countries that we have here. And we chose these 6 countries because we were interested in them, but also because they are spread around the world. So they gave us a good sense of how migration might look in different regions. And then we focused on 4 major variables in our analysis. The first one being the percent of international migrant stock, and then the second being the total amount of CO2 emissions in each country. The third being natural disasters, the total damage of natural disasters in each country, and then the percentage of women. But we also just looked at gender in general. And we looked at the years 2000 and 2024 for this key summary data table, just to see how these values would change over a longer period of time.
Okay, let's explore my migrant stock statistic for Argentina, Australia, China, Germany, Somalia, and the United States. From the descriptive statistic of migrant stock from 2000 to 2024, China has the highest central tendency, followed by Germany and the US. In contrast, Somalia, Argentina, and Australia show the lower central tendencies in migrant stock. These statistics show the current state of migration and also help connecting to issues like CO2 emissions.
Oh, we can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. For our first research question, we focused on if there was a relationship between total CO2 emissions as well as the number of people migrating to different regions across the world. We did this by focusing on our 6 countries, and this is a line chart showing the percentage. So how we calculated the percentage was we found the total number of migrants divided by the total population to ensure that, especially for populations with the bigger amounts of people, such as China and Germany, we had an equal distribution of data to really analyze exactly how the percentages change. And then, as you can see, Somalia and Germany have the highest percentage of international migrants. There's a huge spike around 2015 for Somalia. However, we don't know if there's a connection to CO2 emissions because there was a lot of political instability in the country, as when we did a couple of like research and looked into Google, seeing what was going on during those years. However, other than Somalia, other countries either at a constant or a slight increase with the rate of migration in the last 24 years, and there's not a clear or high value change.
For CO2 emissions from 2000 to 2024, China, the US, and Germany show the highest central tendency among the 6 countries. In contrast, Australia, Argentina, and Somalia fall into the lower emission group, with Somalia having the lowest mean at approximately 900,000 tons over the 24 years period. And from the two data set, we then explore the relationship of the total CO2 emission and the number of people migrating to different regions. In order to answer our research question 1, we calculated migration rates by dividing the number of the immigrants from the immigrant stock data set by each country's total population each year. This allows for the better cross-country comparison. We then use a time series line graph to show the relationship between annual CO2 emission and the immigrant percentages.
Yeah, just comparing those two graphs really quickly so you can have a visualization of both of these graphs at the same time. What was an interesting trend with countries with larger percentages of migrant stock have lower CO2 levels. It seems to be China is the only country that has an increasing trend of CO2 emissions, while other countries seem to either be more constant or like almost at a downward trend. But however, we would definitely need to study other correlation and look more deeply into what other factors might impact the CO2 emissions and whether it is directly tied to migration.
From all the visualization, we observed several key trends as shown on the slide. Somalia has the lowest annual CO2 emissions among the 6 countries studied. However, it ranks first in the percentage of immigrant population on average of 10%. Germany's annual CO2 emissions are comparatively low and have decreased consistently over at least 25 years, while its immigration rate has remained stable at approximately 5% of the total population. In contrast, both China and the US produce a large amount of annual CO2 emissions, but their immigrant population percentages remain low when compared with countries like Somalia and Germany.
Yeah, and then looking into data statistics for our total country population, this was used with the United Nations data, and it gave us a number of the amount of people in each country. And what was clear was that China and the USA have the largest population by a large drastic difference, especially compared to Somalia and Argentina. And this descriptive data just gives us a better understanding of how these numbers might differ and other factors that contribute to CO2 emissions, such as population size.
Moving on to our second research question, which is, do regions that experience more climate-related natural disaster also have higher migration rates? And looking at the descriptive statistics for the total disaster damage for the six countries, which are Argentina, Australia, China, Germany, Somalia, and United States. These numbers help us to verify the patterns that we see in the maps and chart later on in our data table. And next, for the bubble map that shows the total numbers of people affected by the disaster between 2000 and 2024. By looking at this map, we can see a couple key takeaways. First, China has the largest number of people affected by disaster by a huge margin. However, China does not show high migration rates in our earlier table, and this suggests that disaster impact does not automatically translate into higher migrant stock. And second, you can see Somalia has the second highest level of disaster impact relative to population size. And Somalia also has the highest migrant proportion. This hints at the possible link between environmental instability and outward migration. And lastly, countries like Germany and Australia experience much lower disaster impact and also show a very small changes in migration percentage. And this supports the idea that stable environments may encourage people to stay. Next. In this map, we can see the total number of affected people by disaster in the 2000s, and we see a very large differences between countries. China stands out the most with more than 25 million people affected. This is important because it's way higher than any other countries in our data sets. And overall, the 2000 map shows the climate-related disaster were concentrated heavily in Asia and parts of Africa. The next map, we have the total number of affected people by disaster in the 2024. And when we compared the 2024 map to 2000, the pattern shift in some interesting ways. For example, China's affected population dropped sharply from more than 25 million to around 148,000. And on the other hand, Argentina jumps from about 38,000 to over 800,000, which shows how unpredictable disaster can be from year to year. And the 2024 map overall looks more evenly distributed than the 2000 map, but certain countries still carry a much heavier burden. And the biggest takeaway is that disaster impact levels do not stay stable over time. Countries can experience dramatic increases or decreases depending on the type of event in a given year. We have the line chart we shows earlier of the migrant stock over time. And based on this chart, we can tell that Somalia shows the largest overall increase, which align with the long-term conflict drought and environmental pressures. Argentina and US shows small but steady increase across the years. And lastly, China and Australia remain low and relatively flat, showing that their migration pattern are not strongly tied to their disaster level. And moving on to the research key finding. From the visualizations, we observe several key trends, including how environmental pressure does not affect all countries the same way. For example, China has very high disaster impact below migration. Somalia has both high disaster impact and high migration. And this shows that environmental stress might be interacts with other factors such as political economies and social factors over migration rates. Moreover, countries with stable infrastructure tend to show smaller changes in migrant stock. Germany, Australia, and the US show relatively modest shift in migration despite experiencing disasters. And disaster impact needs to be evaluated alongside population size and other conditions. Raw numbers alone do not tell the full story. So China's largest number reflect its population size, and Somalia's number reflect vulnerability. Germany's small total reflects strong disaster response system. And overall, our early analysis suggests that natural disasters are only one piece of a much larger migration puzzle. Understanding these patterns will help us refine our research questions and guide the next stage of our project. And moving on to the next research question.
Yeah, so our third research question is split into two different parts. We were really interested in if there was a potential connection between gender and migration. So the first thing we did was we chose a year, which was 2024, and we analyzed the ratio of female and male migrants across our 6 countries at the mid-year international stock. For this, what we found was that the percentages for every country was nearly 50%, with a very small range of differences. So, for example, Somalia had the highest difference, which was only 54% of migrants were females, while China had 44% of the migrants being male, which is only a 10% difference between the smallest and largest numbers. For as well as for these percentages, we did include the percentage of we did take into consideration how population size might affect this. So this is also including that information. And then thinking about once we understood how population migration rates differ depending on gender, we decided to look into our CO2 emissions for the year of 2024 specifically. From that, we understood China had the highest CO2 emissions by a far margin of 12 billion tons compared to United States, which was around 5 billion tons. And then this increasingly decreases to as it goes down countries, with Somalia being less than a billion tons of CO2 emissions, which doesn't really correlate with our findings that we found on the other slide. So moving on, comparing both of these slides, what we realize is that there's a nearly even split for all countries, and gender does not play a huge role in migration, and there's not a clear correlation between CO2 emissions and gender migration because it's nearly evenly split. So we can't draw any further connections between that. However, I think what could be really interesting about this data set in migration and gender is maybe looking into the difficulties faced during migration, or potentially even looking at data sets from further in the past, such as the 1990s, where it might have been harder for a woman to migrate alone because of like biases and laws and being subjugated to a lot more societal pressures. However, what was really interesting about doing this data set is that there is a lack of correlation, even though it was one of the data sets that we had assumed there would be a strong correlation. So it was really interesting to see our findings kind of display a different mindset that we didn't originally have when we started.
Cannot hear you.
I'm sorry. In conclusion, there was a lack of connection between migration and gender, and CO2 emissions might affect climate, but then a lot of other factors contribute, especially related to migration. So, it's possible that it could be due to political instability or other climate-related measurements. And then there was not a noticeable trend on relationships between the annual CO2 emissions and percentage of total amount of immigrants in the 6 selected countries that we focused on. And then a couple of our limitations were related to time. We were not able to create various visualizations to answer all of our research questions. So it's possible that they might not completely represent the relationships between our chosen variables, or that they might not account for other impacts on migration rates. And then In addition, our data sets had different ranges of years. So, the migrant stock data set included data from every 5 years, which kind of limited the times that we could look at for the other data sets. And then each data set also had a different range of years. So we really had to choose what each data set could include for us. And I think that with more detailed data or data with more consistent year ranges, it could strengthen our visualizations and our analysis. And then in the future, if we were to kind of add on to what we explored in this project, we would love to see other countries and see if those would indicate different types of migration patterns related to natural disasters, political instability, or other impacts on migration. And then we would also validate our research findings by comparing the variables with more data sets, specifically more diverse data sets from other sources. And we would also explore the same variables with more countries or by region to see if there are larger migration patterns. Yeah, thank you guys for listening.